All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Mainly Hoops podcast. If you're enjoying the content, please make sure to like and subscribe. We appreciate your support. But we're going to dive right into a game preview here in Sioux Falls, Iowa State and Mississippi State. Cody, what are your initial thoughts on this matchup?
Yeah, I mean, two teams that we haven't really seen much from. Obviously, they're both coming off of bye game competition. I'm definitely excited to see what happens with Iowa State's offense this season after coming off of the best year in the Otzelberger era, where they lost some really key pieces to that offense in Keyshawn Gilbert and Curtis Jones, who made one of the biggest leaps as an overall just offensive weapon from his second to last year to his last season at Iowa State. But it's something that I'm trying to monitor is like, how did they replace that? And it does look like they're trying to add shooting into the lineup just like last season. They've added Killian Toure into the starting lineup. I think a lot of people thought it was going to be Dominic Nelson as the starting guard, or at least the guard that gets the most minutes. He's played 40.1% of the minutes, and Toure's played 65% of the minutes through two games. And then it's been the standard guys outside of that, like obviously Lipsy, Jefferson, Momcilovic are going to be carrying most of the load as an offense. It's just, two of those guys don't really shoot the ball that well. And can Milan Momcilovic really, be that second go-to scorer on this offense after Joshua Jefferson? So there are, some things I'm monitoring there. Like, Bateman's gotten some time, Heisey's gotten some time, but and they're solid shooters in their own right. But it's just a matter of, do they fit into the scheme defensively? And for Mississippi State, I'm trying to figure out what the fit is, particularly with the backcourt, with like who's next to Hubbard. In game one, it was more Jabari McGee than it was Jaden Epps, and McGee fit in pretty well as that secondary guard who can get downhill and score it and create for others. Jaden Epps just didn't really feel like a guy that is going to fit next to Josh Hubbard all that well. I thought Epps was going to have the ball in his hands a little bit more and turn Hubbard into more of that off-ball shooter, which would be like really nice for his skill set. Would be really nice to open up his game a little bit. But, it was a lot of Josh Hubbard with the ball in his hands, and Jaden Epps was kind of just in the corner, just, hanging out. And that's not really his play style overall. I think he ended up taking 5 threes. He went 2 for 7 from the floor and didn't get like a super high volume of minutes, but they played a lot of different guys as well. Like they played 4 front court players, Jamarian Davis Fleming and the international guy and Sergey Makura played a high volume of minutes. They kind of just split with Ballard and Achor, who didn't really do a ton either. So they may have a little bit more front court depth in this game and more than I really imagined overall. So I think that could be an area that they could lean on in this game against like a thinner center position with Iowa State with Buchanan and Eric Mulder right now. So I think that could be a spot that they could eventually exploit in this game on the offensive glass.
Marcus, what are your initial thoughts here?
Yeah, like Cody said, I mean, it's two teams that hasn't really had much to show yet, both playing bye games. And I think there are a few stats to kind of look at, like Mississippi State typically, really good on the offensive glass. Up to this point, they're 31st in the country in offensive rebound rate. Granted, competition plays a role in that, but this is an area they're typically really good. And Iowa State's been good on the defensive glass, through their 2 games. Again, it's like not a ton to show for it. I do think this is an area where potentially Mississippi State could give some trouble. Just like looking at the Iowa State roster, you mentioned like depth. I just think Mississippi State could be a little bit more athletic to get on the offensive glass. But then looking also at like Iowa State's defense, typically forces a bunch of turnovers. They're 23rd in turnover rate defense so far. Mississippi State, last year they were 79th in the country in turnovers per game on offense. So they took care of the ball pretty well. You know, they were, I think, 10.7 a game last year. So far this year, they're 13th in turnover rate on the offensive end. So I think this is something to monitor. Like the Iowa State defense, I think always like speeds you up and forces more turnovers regardless. But, you know, if Mississippi State can take care of the basketball, you know, I think it puts them in a fairly good spot in this game. But, you know, you're looking at, you know, two teams, like particularly for Iowa State, you know, who lack a ton of like offensive firepower depth, right? You know, they lost a lot from last year, as you mentioned, and you know, who of these others is going to step up? Like Jamarian Bateman hasn't really played much and hasn't shown a ton, and that was a guy coming in who, at least from my perspective, like I thought he could contribute. You know, Nate Heisey is kind of what he is. You know, so far it's been Momcilovic, who's been fantastic, right, averaging 20 through 2 games, and then Jefferson and Lipsey. But, you know, they're going to need other guys to step up, you know, if they're going to really compete with, you know, some of the top teams, particularly once they get into conference play. So that's something to monitor, I think, in this game. And then on the other side as well, like who can kind of step up and be that next guy with Josh Hubbard. You mentioned McGee. He had a good game against North Alabama, 14 in 23 minutes. But aside from that, there was nobody else with more than 8 points. That was Quincy Ballard with 8. So they're also going to need other guys to kind of step up eventually, especially in a game like this against an Iowa State defense that, you know, is typically going to give trouble. You know, it's not the same defense they've had in years past, but at the same time, like it's still, you know, a solid unit.
Cody, what are Mississippi State's keys to the game going to be to come out of South Dakota with a win?
Yeah, I personally think it's a pretty tough path for them, but I think first is ball security. Like Marcus mentioned, they have to be really good there, and it's going to be up to Josh Hubbard for the most part. And throughout his career, he's been awesome in this area. He has an 8.9% career turnover rate. I think some of that is like his shot chucking mentality, but obviously he's going to knock those down at a pretty high clip. But, you know, when you're putting a shot up on the backboard, you're not turning the ball over. So ultimately, I think that's going to be a key. Another key is, you know, at some point in this game, like Iowa State's going to be they're always aggressive in pick and roll coverage. And I think they're going to do that here again. And, you know, can they just force the ball out of Hubbard's hands and force someone to create in short roll? Can they force, you know, weak side shot creation from these other guys? And, you know, somebody's going to have to step up. And ideally in the short roll, it would be Chor as that, you know, as that short roll creator, finding the weak side shooters. It's just, is he going to play a super high volume of minutes? He only played 40% of the minutes in the first game, and they didn't really shoot the ball that well outside of Hubbard. You know, outside of him, they shot it 5 for 19 from 3, and there just wasn't much firepower. Like Jabari McGee went 2 for 3, but he's not a guy that I trust to knock it down at a high clip throughout the entire season if he's getting high volume. You know, Sean Jones is a guy that's out there to, you know, he's a defender. He's purely really a defender, energy guy. He took 5 threes in the first game, which I don't really think that's a guy that Chris Jans wants shooting at that high of volume. And they have some other guys down the board, like Epps needs to be better. But ultimately, they need to find that second guy, like Marcus mentioned, you know, when Iowa State is forcing the ball out of Josh Hubbard's hands. And they also need to get on the offensive glass by committee with the 4 guys that I mentioned. Like if Jamarian Davis Fleming and McCure are going to play, they need to be values on the offensive glass and just overall as a rim presence.
And Marcus, what does Iowa State have to do to stop the upset? What are their keys to the game?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is keeping Mississippi State off the offensive glass, right? You know, Sean Jones had 6 offensive rebounds against North Alabama. They had 19 offensive rebounds as a team. It's a strength of this team. I think it's an area where, as I mentioned, Mississippi State might be able to have some success against this Iowa State team. So can they limit second chance opportunities? And, you know, can they make Josh Hubbard's life tougher, right? I think you just have to throw different things at him in a game like this, right? Or we didn't see a ton of others helping him out in their opening game. This is an opportunity where, I think you try and make others beat you. So throw different coverages at him, try and frustrate him. He's going to get his because he's obviously proven to be a really good player for, several years now. So I think the key is just to try and make life difficult for him in this matchup, make him take tough ones, and kind of live with the results and hope that, the others don't beat you, and you can limit second chance opportunities. And then on the offensive end, I think just continuing to get, production from those three guys that I mentioned, Lipsy, Momcilovic, and Jefferson. I would expect like efficiency to probably drop here shortly, like especially out of Momcilovic, 56% through 2 games from the field. He's a career like 42% shooter from the field. So he's not going to continue to shoot it at this clip. Obviously, playing bye games, the field goal percentage is going to be higher. But, I think if they can continue to get similar production out of these three, especially tomorrow night, then they're going to be just fine and should walk out of here with a win.
All right, before we wrap things up, who's your pick for this game? Marcus, it looks like you're going with Iowa State, but let's hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I'll go Iowa State. I'll say they win this one by like 8-10. Well, let's say they win 74-65.
I like it. Cody, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I like Iowa State here too. I've had concerns with this Mississippi State team on both ends of the floor. Like Achoro was a guy that I had as an X factor, and night number 1, I don't really think he necessarily passed that test as being that second guy or being really that kind of that Cam Matthews replacement on the offensive end. He only finished with 2 points, didn't have any assists. He got on the glass a little bit, but ultimately he needs to step up and be better, and it's going to be really tough for him to do that against an Iowa State defense that I would call probably a top 5 unit in the country. So, and Iowa State, I guess through the first couple of games has proven that they do have some other options in Killian Toure and Jamarian Bateman. Like those guys as freshmen are stepping up and have passed the test so far in bye games. So ultimately, I think Iowa State can handle business here. I'd say it's a fairly low scoring game. Where'd you have it? In like the 70s, Marcus? Is that what you said?
Yeah, 74-65.
Yeah, I'll go 77-62. I think Iowa State kind of handles business here.
All right, we're going to wrap things up here. As always, thank you for listening to the Mainely Hoops podcast.